Thanks for joining us today, and thanks to Alberta Lamb Producers for putting this all together. I think we can now view my laptop screen.
Correct, Dale.
And we want to get it into the slide mode here. Here we go. Okay, I just have to back up to the front here, starting lambs on feed. So again, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be doing this. I think starting lambs on feed is a very timely topic for this time of year. I've approached this from the fact that, from the perspective that people will have lambs on grass right now, soon to be weaned and put on to feed. And where do we go from here? What kind of things do we have to go ahead and look at? A brief outline. I'm talking again about this late weaned lamb, and I'm going to define that a little bit. We'll talk about things to it upon arrival. Key part of getting lambs on feed is increasing the grain content of the ration. We'll talk a little bit about feeding whole grains, bunk and pen management, self-feeding versus bunk Fenceline feeding, and then common feedlot disorders and diseases, knowing when to stop, and as Robin mentioned, we'll have time for questions at the end. So, late weaned lambs, by my definition, are typically 4 to 6 months of age, 60 pounds or larger. They've likely been on pasture, may or may not have had access to grain in a creep feeder on pasture. With the advent of 3-in-1 feeders, that type of feeder, it certainly is possible to efficiently start to keep lambs on grain feed in the pasture situation. They've probably recently been weaned. The weaning process here is primarily a behavioral one. It's separation. The issue is separation from the dams, the mothers at this particular time, and the stress that calls. Nutritionally, the lambs have probably been somewhat independent of the ewes, eating a fair bit of grass at this time. So it's mainly a behavioral or in the mind kind of stress that these lambs might be suffering. Various degrees of stress, of course, based on whether the lambs are just coming off the pasture and staying on the farm of origin, going into a feedlot setting, or a major degree of stress if they've been weaned, gone through a sale barn, been trucked some distance before they arrive at the feedlot. And lots of variation in that scenario, and lots of challenges with respect to especially the major stresses that would occur with purchased lambs. So first thing we can talk about is upon arrival or entering the feedlot. Most of this is pretty common sense, and I'm sure that you've thought about this, but you want them in a dry, comfortable pen right off the bat, get them unloaded and into that pen where they're going to be for a while as soon as possible. No mixing with existing lambs, because you want to treat this group as with some special procedures. 200 to 300 lambs per pen. The smaller the number, the better, of course, in terms of allowing better supervision and observation of any individuals that might need extra attention. And like sort by weight if possible. If you've got the facilities to feed 65-pound average lambs separate from 80-pound average lambs, it'll help you and help the lambs get them on feed. In terms of first nutrition, good quality grass, hay, and feeders is usually the arriving or starting ration that we like to see. 12 inches of bunk space per lamb is required so that they can all eat at the same time if they're hungry coming off that truck or coming into the feedlot. A little bit of legume is okay, but we prefer not to have more than 25%. Grass hay, if it's palatable, avoid the stemmy or moldy hay issues that you might see in some hay. But grass hay is a good way to get them started off for the first day and get something back into that stomach, again, especially if they're long haul and have been shrunk out during that process. So good quality hay is the first thing to be putting in front of them. Water, of course, is essential too. Probably that's the first thing that should go in front of them or have access to at the same time. Access to abundant, good quality water. In this case, we need about ½ an inch of lineal drinking space or room per lamb. The feeder that you see in the top right hand there, the self-serving water bowl, provides a limited amount of space, and it might be something that's a bit foreign to the lambs. They have to get up on that platform to access it, that type of thing. If lambs have been reared in that environment and they're used to it, fine. If not, you may have to provide some help in finding the water, and therefore having some bunk or water bowl space that you see in the bottom there, where there's more lineal space per lamb. It's maybe a trough situation that they've been a bit more familiar with. But keep in mind, if they've been for the last few months out on pasture and drinking from dugouts or creeks or lake shores, that type of thing, this is going to be a foreign or a different environment for them. And water intake in the first few hours in the feedlot is so important in terms of reducing the stress levels in these lambs. Just a reminder about what I call basic ruminant nutrition here. You know, remember that we're really feeding the bugs or the microbes in the rumen, who then in turn are feeding the sheep. And it always amazes me how populous that rumen fluid is. A teaspoon or approximately a millimeter of rumen fluid contains 10 to 50 billion individual bacteria of a wide variety of different types and kinds and species. It also contains some protozoa, yeasts, and fungi. So keep in mind that we're really feeding the rumen bugs, who then in turn feed the sheep. And this schematic kind of shows that. 82, in some cases 100% of the nutrients that are consumed, you know, chewed up and swallowed by the sheep, are cycled through the microbes before the nutrients get absorbed. So again, in this schematic here, shows feed nutrients coming in, microbial digestion taking place. It breaks down these feeds into ammonia, a simple, very simple atom, and also to volatile fatty acids, VFAs, or organic acids. The organic acids are absorbed from the rumen, are primarily the energy source that the sheep lives on. The ammonia molecules are reformed into microbial protein, the protein in the microbe body itself, which then, as it's flushed down the digestive tract, you know, provides protein in a more conventional form to the sheep. So everything goes through the microbes, and we want to keep them as happy as possible, especially during the startup phase, the first few days, and especially while we're trying to adapt the animal to grain feeding. So why have I just talked about grain feeding right off the bat? Well, grain feeding systems usually are the most economical in the feedlot, and it accomplishes the desired rate of gain and the amount of finish or fat cover that's required in a reasonably short length of time. That's not to say that you couldn't accomplish feedlot gains with good quality forage, but it wouldn't be as rapid a rate of gain. And typically, considering the amount of investment in a feedlot, the cost of interest rate on the investment in the lambs themselves, most field operators want to go with a grain-based ration. That can be as low as 60 to 70% of the dry matter being grain, or it could be as high as 100% of the dry matter being the grain mix. We see that in a few feedlots, especially once you've made the proper adjustments to get them onto that feed. A little bit of a side note here, a 50-50 mix of forage to grain is not particularly efficient, and this has been shown repeatedly in different studies that if you have less grain or more grain than the 50-50, you're going to have a better efficiency in terms of feed conversion. And the thinking there is that the microbes are battling for control there. The ones that digest forages and roughages are battling with the ones that digest starch, and neither one comes out the winner, and we're a little bit inefficient in that 50-50 area. So be below 50-50, you know, 30-70 or 70-30 kind of thing. And again, you can go as high as 90 to 100% of grain mix with proper management and experience. So grain feeding systems, we should expect rapid growth rates, 0.5 to 1 pound per day if we've got any kind of quality and environmental situation that's favorable to the lambs. However, lambs do need to adjust to the grain feeding. Keep that in mind, that we need to adjust them, because grain and starch in particular is not something that lambs are naturally able to cope with. And that's, again, we talk about the lambs needing to be adjusted, but it's again the rumen microbial population that needs time to adjust. In the rumen, we have different microbial species, hundreds of different types of species, probably thousands, and they specialize in digesting different kind of nutrients. Broadly speaking, we've got the fiber digesters, or the roughage forage digesters, if you want to call them, and they are the dominant population. They make up the majority of the rumen microbes when forage is fed. And they produce a pH in the rumen of about 6 to 7, slightly acidic at 6 to near basic or neutral at 7. And that's what would be kind of considered to be the normal or the natural rumen environment for them. When we introduce starch or grains into the rumen, then a group of microbes called the starch digesters grow and populate and become more dominant as the level of grain feeding increases. This results in a rumen pH of about 5.5 to 6. So now we're getting to be a fair bit more acidic with respect to the rumen environment. Within the starch digesters, we have what we call lactic acid producers. And they grow more quickly when starch is added to the rumen. That population thrives when it's first exposed to starch. We also have what we call lactic acid users. They grow most slowly. They do grow to a population where they're useful in converting lactic acid to volatile fatty acids, in this case propionate. And again, remember, it's the VFAs, the organic acids, that provide the energy source to the rumen. Keep in mind on the pH scale there that a pH of 5.5 is actually 10 times more acidic than a pH of 6.5. The pH scale is what we call a log scale, and it's not a linear scale. So if the rumen falls from 6 to 5.5, that's a significant difference in the acidity in the rumen. So lactic acidosis, or grain overload as it's sometimes called, or simply acidosis, it occurs when the ruminants are not slowly adjusted to grain in the diet, or receive accidentally perhaps a slug feeding of grain. So if you've put the grain out intentionally but put out too much, or if we have an accident where a bin breaks open or the sheep get into a tote bag of grain inadvertently, consume a lot of grain, then we can get this lactic acidosis condition. And again, it's a rapid growth of the lactic acid producers before the lactic acid users can catch up and do their job. So the pH can fall below 5.5 when too much grain is fed without allowing the microbes to adapt. And this is where we come into the symptoms of lactic acidosis. One of the first things that we can measure in a lactic acidosis situation, if we can get some rumen fluid there, we'll see that the pH is often below 5 and that 5.5 in that neighborhood of 5.0, 5.2. So lactic acidosis has to be avoided at all costs. It can ruin lambs, it can cause liver abscesses, and it can even kill the feeder lambs. The symptoms that we would see here would be, for example, would be depressed, lethargic, they're just doggy, slow around there, the feedlot. They're loose, have diarrhea. They exhibit strong thirst symptoms. They're thirsty, looking for water. They're dehydrated. The eyeballs might be sunk in. Something that you wouldn't see from an outside observation is what we call rumen stasis. The rumen is starting to shut down. Normally, the rumen is a very athletic or active muscle. It's churning the feed and so on. And when we see lactic acidosis starting to occur, that rumen is starting to shut down. Lack of cud chewing. A healthy sheep is chewing its cud when it's not eating, doing other activities. So if you don't see any cud chewing, again, this is a sign of perhaps we've got lactic acidosis, grain overload starting to take place. And then the final stages, they start to stagger, they're walking sore, lactic acid has accumulated in the lower limbs, extremities, around the foot area and that type of thing. You might even see what we call a sawhorse stance, where the front legs are a little bit further positioned towards the front of the body. And again, that's an attempt to deal with pain and misery in the lower extremities there, as well as in the digestive tract. So how do we adjust the rumen microbes to grain? And again, we're adjusting them to starch. Well, we're going to talk in a few minutes here about two different systems, grain feeding on a self-fed basis versus a limit-fed basis. So let's start off with getting lambs onto a self-fed grain system. And in this case, the grain and the roughage are likely fed separately, but both are available on a self-fed or the roughage might be limit-fed. But the key here is to look at the grain mix and how many pounds per head per day and when we should get them up onto what we call full feed. So as we talked about, the first day that the lambs do arrive in the feedlot, they're offered that roughage, that good quality grass, a free choice. If everything looks good, the lambs are active, they're up and around, they're moving around, by the second or the fourth day, we can probably bring in 1/4 pound of grain per head per day. And we would be limit feeding this in some trough kind of a system, whether it's a bunk line system or troughs within the pen, but you have to have a way to feed out 1/4 pound per lamb per day for that particular time. After day 4, day 5 to 7, we can double that. We can increase that to half a pound a day. On the roughage side, we're still keeping that grass roughage type of hay free choice and available to them as much as they want to eat. By day 8 to 10, we can bump that to 0.75. By day 11 to 13, we can get up to a pound a day per head per day, and we're still keeping that roughage free choice. Now at day 14 to 16, we can get up to about a pound and a half. We can again make about a half a pound adjustment there, but now we have to start to manage the roughage source and limit feed that roughage to probably about 30% of the total diet. We have to do something to encourage the lambs to consume that pound and a half of grain on a consistent basis, and with every lamb getting into that neighborhood. The next bump up there is 17 to 19 days. We're up to about 2 pounds now of grain. And if we're getting to that level, you might want to think about splitting that into 2 daily feedings of a pound each. A slug of 2 pounds of grain and a 60-pound lamb, 70-pound lamb is a fair bit of grain. And again, to allow them to more easily adapt to it, splitting that into 2 feedings is probably advisable. Now here again, we want to try to restrict the intake of that roughage to encourage consistent intake of the grain. From day 19 to 21, we get another half pound increase there. You're getting up to about 2.5 pounds. You want to limit your feed now to 10 to 20% of it being, the roughage being 10 to 20% of the ration. Some of you might want to stay at that level if you consistently want to get a high grain level into them, but want to feed the grain. You can stop there at 2.5 pounds and feed that. But that's laborious to get out there and distribute that grain twice a day. You're probably better off to get into a self-feeder situation. After day 21, we can get up to about 3 pounds a day, and that's basically a free choice system. That's about the maximum amount of grain and hay that they will eat, or roughage that they will eat. And that's what we would consider them to be on full feed at that level. Just keep in mind that lambs that are 4 to 5 months of age off grass should have a minimum of, in my opinion, of 10% roughage in the ration. I know some of the feeders get by with just the straw that they pick off the bedding pack and seem to do well. Some of them actually that are on slotted floors don't want to have any roughage in the ration, and can get by with 100% grain intake if they follow some careful procedures that we'll talk about in a minute. Now, how do you limit that feed? Well, using straw or low quality roughage can be fed free choice to limit that intake. So if you've got a low quality forage, roughage like straw, available to them on a free choice basis, they're not going to eat very much of that. They'll pick through and get the better parts, the chaff and so on, but that'll give them enough of a roughage factor or a scratch factor to keep the rumen active and growing. A low quality grass hay would do the same thing. What I don't like to see in this situation is a high quality grass, or high quality legume hay. You know, the problem there is the fact that they'll go back and forth. They'll like the legume hay, they'll come to it readily, but the danger there is that one day they'll overconsume on the grass legume hay and cut back on their intake of the grain. And therefore that rumen population starts to adjust back. Well, they think we're going to be a fiber digester now, and the fiber digesters take off. And then when they do come back the next day and maybe take on that 3 pounds plus of grain, we've got a situation where we've got kind of the opportunity for constant digestive upset. So by limit feeding physically or with low quality roughage, we can try to stabilize or keep that rumen in a consistent level of forage to grain. And that's what the rumen microbes like. What's the lambs like? They like consistency in their daily diet. The other feeding system that we're going to talk about here is the total mixed ration system, where you would feed this in a bunk or a trough to the lambs. And here we're working with the theory here is that every mouthful of feed intake is consistent based on what the farmer has mixed for the ration. And again, in this chart, we show that day 1, we start off with 0 grain in the mix and get them on feed and water, 100% roughage, that grass hay start again. Day 2, 4, we can start with 20% of the dry matter being grain and 80% being roughage. And if you're using silage, this is where you can start to add your silage into the ration. It would be nice not to make all 80% of that roughage silage right off the bat and still have some dry hay in that mix. in order to allow them to adjust to silage. Silage is sometimes a bit of a foreign feed. It's a different taste, and some of the lambs might be put off by the taste and odor of silage, so keep some dry hay in that TMR so that the lambs come to it readily. And then you can see as we go down the columns there, day 5 to 7, we can increase that to the grain mix to 30% of the total, the corresponding 70% being roughage. And again, this is on a dry matter basis. So knowing the dry matter content of your roughage, especially if it's silage, is important to calculate out these numbers. Day 8 to 10, 40-60. Day 11 to 13, we're in that 50-50 range, and so on up till we get to day 21, where we could be as high as 90% of the dry matter being grain and 10% being roughage. Now, you don't necessarily have to go all the way to 90%. In a TMR, it's pretty easy to stop at that 70-30. 60-40 ratio, if that's what you think is best. If your roughages are priced competitively relative to feed grains, and you're getting the kind of intake that you and the kind of gains that you're looking for, you can certainly stop at that 60% of the ration being the grain mix. And again, just a reminder, I like to see that lambs that are off grass have never been or have had access to high roughage diets should maintain a 10% roughage in the final level of the TMR. Whole grains. Now, this use of whole grains is something that I always get questions on during presentations, at meetings and that type of thing. The literature is very clear that whole grains should be used when feeding feeder lambs. Anything above 50 pounds, lambs can do a good job of digesting that. So a ration that's whole grains, if you do have to provide some supplemental vitamins, minerals, and protein, you can certainly add a pelleted supplement to the whole grains. And if it's a TMR, you can certainly add your roughage portion as well. But the use of whole grains increases rumination and chewing. So the lambs will first guzzle down the whole grain, and then they regurgitate or ruminate that and chew it better and better. That produces saliva and a natural buffer. Saliva is full of sodium bicarb. It's a natural buffer that helps that with keeping that acidity in the rumen in line. So whole grains are healthier for the rumen, reduce the risk of acidosis, and coincidentally improves performance and reduce costs. Again, I get the observation, oh, I can see some whole grains in the manure laying on the ground there. Well, you might see a bit there, but if you pick them up and squeeze those whole grains, they're probably been digested to some extent, chewed up to some extent. And don't worry about seeing some whole grains on the ground. Now, this chart here, this table, shows some research that was done at UBC way back in 1973. And Dr. Malcolm Tate and his grad student there, they fed an identical ration, but in 3 different physical forms. So this is the exact same ration ingredients, just a different physical form. And the top one there shows whole barley plus a pelleted supplement. And whole barley was about 80% of the diet, and pelleted supplement was 20%. And the average daily gain there that they got was 0.64, the best of the 3. And the feed conversion rate was 3.85 pounds of dry matter to a pound of gain. When they took that same ration and rolled the barley and added the supplement, they got the middle level there, 0.55 average daily gain, and the feed conversion rate that now slipped a little bit to 4.43. And then when they ground and pelleted that diet, again, I know some of you might like to have a total pelleted ration because you think there's no separation, it's easier to manage, et cetera, et cetera. But in this case, it actually depressed the gain. Average daily gain dropped to 0.48. The feed conversion rate remained competitive around 3.98. So again, now this has been repeated in many, many studies with barley, corn, and other grains. And in my opinion, it's always my recommendation to use whole grains when feeding these lambs. There's one exception I'll talk about when we talk about bunk management here in a few minutes, but whole grains, barley, corn, they can certainly chew them up, and it's healthier for the lambs to proceed with that kind of a ration. You don't have to pay the cost of processing the grain, so there's another advantage there as well. Grain choices. So what grains are best to feed lambs? Again, a common question. Really, it's based on cost per unit of energy And barley and corn are usually the most economical feed grains. Barley in Alberta and Saskatchewan, corn as we go east to Manitoba and Ontario is somewhat competitive most of the time. Oats can be used, although they're lower in energy, and so they're about 80% the value of barley. But if you look at the grain markets, you'll often see oats priced a little bit higher than barley. And good quality, high energy oats are in quite a bit of demand for the food industry and the horse industry. I think that's why you often see them priced a little higher. But don't feel that your sheep have to have oats because they like oats. It doesn't matter what they like. It's the feed that gives you the cheapest gains that's important. Wheat and rye, sometimes wheat and occasionally rye. There's some off grades that are available at discount prices, and they can be used and be effective in feedlot rations. As a general guideline, we don't like to put more than 50% of the grain portion of the diet as wheat or rye. So 50% of the grain as wheat, 50% as barley or corn. Certainly can be possible. We don't like to put 100% of the grain portion as wheat because wheat the starch in it is digested very rapidly, especially compared to barley and corn, and will give you more problems with acidosis. Now, if you were in a ration that had 60% roughage and or 60% grain and 40% roughage, having 40% roughage there will certainly help deal with the acidosis issue. You might get by with a higher level of wheat and rye in that kind of ration. But if you're on a ration that's high in grain, 80% plus, not more than half of that grain should be wheat and rye. Peas, beans, and lentils, often, again, because of off types or some harvest conditions, can be economical. As a guideline here, though, as a general guideline, I don't like to see more than 33% of the grain portion of the diet being peas, beans, and lentils. Now, if they're just used as a protein source, you probably don't have to go that high. But again, when they're priced economically, they can be a protein and an energy source. The reason I say 33% of the diet, the comment at the bottom of the slide there, peas have been reported to create an off flavor, a different flavor when fed as the only energy source. When they were the 100% of the grain portion of the ration. So if they do cause an off flavor to your product, your customers aren't going to be happy, and you're not going to be getting the prices, and you may have to actually pay back and buy some carcasses back or some boxed lamb back, as the case in the situation that I described did occur. Peas, beans, and lentils may need to be processed. Sometimes they seem to be very dry and hard, and the sheep will sort them out of the grain mix and not eat them. And in that case, a coarse rolling or a very coarse grinding might be required. But I guess I would test that particular product and see if they will eat it in a whole form before I would spend money on breaking it up into a finer product. Byproduct energy feeds can be used. And a number of my clients really like to look at byproduct options because they're usually available for a reasonably low cost of energy or protein unit. Commonly are grain, oilseed, and legume screenings. These are the cleanings that are available from the industry, and they certainly can be used. Beet pulp is another one. It's a byproduct of the sugar beet industry. A nice product to work with, but again, there's some limitations on how much you want to feed in that particular regard. Distillers dried grains, high level of protein there coming out of the ethanol industry. Could be wheat distillers, corn distillers, that they provide an opportunity for reducing feed costs. Bakery waste products, we start to wonder how we can handle these in an efficient manner, especially in a large feedlot. But bakery waste products can be available and basically are almost the value of wheat and can be treated like wheat in a ration, even though the product is cooked and so on. Brewery waste products is another one. It can be the screenings from a barley that's clean going into the brewery, or it can be barley screenings plus some malt screenings, byproduct there. Again, high protein and a good energy value. And an odd and unusual one is potato chip waste that we've dealt with here in Alberta for one particular producer that made sense there. Keep in mind with your byproduct energy feeds, it's hard to estimate both the digestible energy value and the dry matter intake. So we recommend feed testing of these ones. There is some specific tests that will help us calculate a digestible energy or do a reasonable job of estimating, but it's certainly not the same as using fibers for forage or bushel weight, volume weight for grains. And dry matter intake is going to be something you would learn by experience. How much would they consume of these particular products? So with byproduct use, they can be economical, but I suggest you get professional advice relative to balancing the ration for these particular items. Be aware that there's maximum usage levels. For example, the fat oil content in a rapeseed or canola seed screening, or in the case of potato chips, can be an issue. You can't feed a lamb more than about 5 to 6% of his diet being fat or oil. In some products, especially feed products, bakery waste products as an example, the sodium level might be an issue that would put a cap or a limit on that. And finally, you have to have some precautions too about some unwanted things that might be in for example, grain screening, and ergot being the one that we want to be careful of and stay away from, and there's certainly well-defined limits of what the sheep can handle on ergots. So don't be afraid of using byproduct feeds. There's some difficulty in handling them. They're often quite dusty and so on, but they can present a reasonable cost alternative to conventional feed grains if used appropriately. Okay, lamb feeding system alternatives. Touched briefly on this as we were looking at the the ramp up or the adjustment tables there in terms of getting grain into the sheep. But a common system for lambs is a self-feeding system, and this is where the grain mix is available continuously. The example here in this picture shows these grain feeders, and the feed bunk there that's available to them is right in front of the lambs. In this case, you want to have at least 4 inches of feeder space per lamb. If you are feeding forage in this system, then you have to, as I recommend, limit the quantity, and you do that via quality, as I mentioned. So a low quality grass or straw, the quality of the forage will limit intake. Or you can feed a high quality forage, but your system must limit the intake there. For example, you could have a grain feeder on one side of the barn here, and a bunk feeder on the other side where you put your good quality forage and alfalfa hay, for example, if that's what you wanted to use on the other side. In the case of the forage, though, you want to make sure that there's equal access by each lamb to that forage, so they're not, not jumping all over each other to get there. The self-feeding systems certainly provide labor efficiency as opposed to having to put feed in front of them every day in a trough. But again, the consistent grain to forage ratio is a challenge with these systems. The alternative is a bunk or fence line feeding system, and this is where we've usually got a TMR is being used, total mixed ration. Again, where every mouthful should be identical as it can be in terms of a sheep feed. In this case, per lamb, we need about 12 inches of bunk space if all the lambs are to be fed at once, which is normally what the bigger feedlots do with that type of system. We've got a greater capital investment here because of this many yards, meters of bunk space being required, but it makes sense in a feedlot that's designed to feed a lot of lambs. Getting a consistent grain to forage ratio is easy to accomplish because that's what you're putting into your mixer, as long as the processing of the forage, silage in particular, is very easy to mix with grains and that type of thing. This provides you with an opportunity for better animal management. When you're feeding in a bunk and all the lambs come to the feed, you can easily observe which lambs are off feed, are sick for some other reason. Sick lambs don't eat very well, and they can be easily identified in that kind of a system, more easily identified in that kind of a system. Now, the bunk or fence line feeding system can be a self-fed system if you've got proper bunk design, i.e. it's big enough to carry a full day's worth of feed, and proper feed management. So you can use the bunks and get your stocking density down to that 4 inches per lamb of lineal space, but you have to be careful to have the bunks full all the time. You've got to manage feed waste in that situation. Again, a bunk design is critical in that regard. Just a word of caution about the bunk feeding system. So it's common in the cattle feeding industry to feed to what we call a slick bunk, or the bunks are cleaned right up for an hour or two or even longer before the next amount of feed is put into them. And that does work in a lot of feedlots. With lamb feeding though, lambs get pretty excited when the bunk is slick and the first feed comes back in there. And it's not uncommon to see those lambs really crashing that bunk, diving in there, trying to be the first to that next mouthful of feed. And this can cause some dead lambs. We can have lambs trampled to death in that situation. They can be pushed up against a divider or a fence post that's along the bunk and break necks. And so we've seen situations where the bunks have been empty and where these lambs have really crashed that feed bunk and harmed some of their pen mates. Now, I mentioned earlier on that whole grains are the preferred method of feeding. We did have a situation one time where the whole grain was corn, and the ration was about a 60% corn, 40% roughage, something in that neighborhood there on a dry matter basis. And the roughage was chopped or hay rather than silage. So the lambs were, in this case, were able to pick out the whole corn. The first lambs to the bunk basically went and cleaned up the corn as quickly as possible and enjoyed that. The second wave of lambs that came to the bunk in a limit feeding situation like this was left with just the roughage to kind of pick through. And while this would have caused eventually a nutritional problem here with lambs that were just eating corn, for example, without the roughage where they were getting their vitamins and minerals out of in a premix situation. This wasn't carried on for very long because some of the lambs were actually being killed and smothered in that situation. And again, it was because when that first feed came, they knew there was corn there and they all wanted to get the corn. When we went to a ground corn in that situation, the problem solved itself because they just couldn't pick ground corn out of that TMR like they could pick out the whole corn. So that solved the problem of lambs really wanting to crash the bunk, and in this case the bunk was full of feed and self-feeding was basically the style in that bunk. So keep in mind that there could be a situation where smaller particle size is desirable, smaller than corn particle size is desirable, and you have to look at that as an option then in your rations. So it's important, again, to pay attention to the details here when you're feeding these lambs. What we call the bunk management area would be looking at things such as feed consumption. We expect feed consumption to get up to 3.5 to 4% dry matter as a percent of body weight. So in that case, a 100-pound lamb would eat 3.5 to 4 pounds of dry matter on a daily basis is what we would expect them to do. And so if they're less than that, we start to wonder what's the problem with our system. Is the feed off, or is there something wrong? So we should be in that window to be effective. We should also be looking at daily differences in feed consumption. What would they be due to? So if you all of a sudden see that, boy, at the end of the day, there's still a lot of feed left in that bunk, what's going on? How come they're not eating it? You have to take a further look at it. Is it due to weather situation? You know, has it gotten really hot the last couple of days and the lambs have just kind of slowed down on their feed intake and therefore your feed offering has to be adjusted accordingly? Or is there some other reason for that? Could it be fines in the rations? You know, if you've got a ration that's based on a byproduct, there's kind of a lot of dust and fines in it. Are the fines building up and that's turning them off? We don't want to eat the fines. Is there feed separation issues? They're eating only a portion of the diet and not cleaning up a certain part of the diet. We have to take a look at that. And again, the comment about lamb behavior at the bunk, slick bunk thing, crashing dead lambs that I've mentioned just previously. So watch how the animals come to the bunk, and ones that don't come to the bunk certainly should get your attention. And then, of course, bunk management, part of it is keeping ahead of the amount demanded by the lambs. So if you're trying to work them up into a full feed situation, you've got to certainly predict, again, you know, this is how much they ate today. Are they going to eat this much or more tomorrow? Put a little bit more in front of them to see what the reaction is. So all that bunk management is probably more of an art and an experiential kind of learning than it is based on science. But this is where your experience or talking to somebody that's experienced is going to come into play. Some things that are just kind of Animal welfare issues, again, that 200 to 300 head per pen. We might see some experienced producers be able to get higher than that, but if you get much higher than that, you're going to have difficulty picking out the poor doers, the sick lambs. We like to see about 30 square feet of lamb in the lot, an area. If there is shed space there, we should probably provide about 6.5 to 7 feet of lamb shed space. If you provide much less than that, under dire environmental conditions, lambs will pack in there and could, again, smother each other if we don't have enough space in the shed. So it's maybe not necessarily in some environments to have an overhead shed, especially in the drier parts of southern prairies. But where you do, make sure you've got enough room for lamb or you're going to cause more problems. I want to keep the lambs dry. The grading slope of the feedlot, water drainage issues there. Keep in mind that sick lambs don't come to feed, so there's an opportunity there to watch that. And a certain percentage of all the lambs that you purchase or put on feed might be called what we call shy feeders that just don't seem to get with the program. And what you have to do with them is sort those out into smaller pens of like shy feeders, perhaps give them a little bit of extra. I guess when it comes to paying attention to details, your powers of observation, I like to use the phrase that came out of some textbook somewhere that says the eye of the shepherd fattens the lamb. So your eye is an important tool that you've got, your powers of observation. TLC, tender love and care, where it's required, that will pay off dividends, and common sense, of course, as well. And this is the sort of the husbandry or the shepherd's responsibility, and his experience will allow him to proceed and be successful in that area. Not going to say a lot about ration balancing today. That's kind of a topic on its own, but here's some rough guidelines that we like to follow. Lambs that are 60 to 90 pounds, I like to see in a ration that's something in the neighborhood of 15 to 16% crude protein and 80 to 85% TDN or energy value. And the estimated dry matter intake should be in that 3.5 to 4 pounds or percent of body weight. Once the lambs get 90 pounds and up, you can drop your protein a little bit, save a little bit on that. And your energy could be a bit lower, but normally it's about the same, TDN of 75 to 85 in this case. And your estimated dry matter is going to back off a little bit in most situations. The common feed grains that I mentioned earlier, generally deficient, won't hit these crude protein levels that I've got in this table. For protein, calcium is always deficient, something you have to supplement, trace minerals as well, vitamin A, D, and E. So a method of getting these supplemental nutrients into them on either a premix or a pelleted supplement is certainly something you have to investigate. Just a word about vitamin E. Beyond the health benefits and the growth benefits of having adequate levels of vitamin E in the ration, it's been shown that 500 IUs of vitamin E per day per lamb will improve meat quality, the shelf life. And if you're direct marketing to your own consumer, or even if you've got a packer that appreciates better quality, shelf life, brighter color, you might want to look at providing a little bit better level of vitamin E than you normally would. 500 IUs of vitamin E costs in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 cents per head per day. Nutritional disorders, these are disorders where there's a nutrient deficiency or impaired production absorption of a nutrient. Important with any situation that looks to be abnormal or causing you a problem is to work with your veterinarian to get a proper diagnosis. One of the things we do see on high grain rations is something called polioencephalomalacia, or simply polio. This is where the vitamin B1 or thiamine metabolism has been impaired. It's either been destroyed in the rumen or it's interacted with another nutrient like sulfur. High sulfates in the water can be a problem. To get around this, we can add thiamine to the ration. We can use buffers to create a more positive rumen environment, or we can increase the roughage ratio. Lamb polio can be a byproduct of what we call subclinical acidosis. So if they're on whole grains and very little roughage, for example, they could still have subclinical acidosis that could cause polio. Blindness, vitamin A deficiency, broken bones with some of the minerals and vitamin D. Bloat we see occasionally, and this is where we've got the grain being too fine or too much high quality legume being in the ration, the leaves especially. And sheep are, artists that are picking out what they want to eat and like, and they certainly like the leaves on legumes, but that can cause them bloat. We've talked about grain overload in detail. Ionophores, such as Bovatec or Rumen and buffers added to the ration can certainly help you deal with grain overload, as well as increasing the roughage content of the ration. Urinary calculi or stones in the urinary tract is usually due to a calcium-phosphorus ratio imbalance, not having it wide enough, more calcium to phosphorus. Normally I like to target a ratio of 2 to 1 in rations to be safe. Ammonium chloride will help prevent this because it acidifies the urine and prevents the buildup of the stones. But usually we can solve the problem quite effectively with a proper calcium-phosphorus ratio. So there are some nutritional disorders that you have to be aware of, but the good news is that they're mostly preventable with sound nutrition and management. Infectious diseases and parasites, again, a reminder that your veterinarian is your ally here for proper diagnosis and treatment protocols. Enterotoxemia, overeating disease, pulpy kidney, vaccination protocol is recommended by your veterinarian. We'll certainly address that. Internal parasites, if they come off pasture and are loaded with worms, there's several different types of worms. Your treatment protocol, your veterinarian will be familiar with that, and so work there. Shipping fever, pneumonia, respiratory diseases, again, management is an issue there, and treatment protocol from your veterinarian. Coccidiosis is another parasitic problem. Treatment and prevention control, improving the environment, getting out of any wet, muddy environment, not feeding on the ground certainly helps. We've got a couple of feed additives. The ionophores and dicoconate are useful. Bovatec, as I mentioned, is an ionophore, and Decox is the trade name for dicoconate. These two are registered as feed additives that can be added to lamb feed, and it's to be used as an aid in the prevention of coccidiosis. It's not going to necessarily control coccidiosis in the face of an outbreak, but it can be used as a prevention for improving your feed efficiency as well. So again, these are diseases that are mostly preventable with sound health management program that you would have consulted your veterinarian with. So the last thing I want to make is knowing when to quit on finishing lambs. Feed efficiency drops off drastically once lambs have reached the desirable fat grade, as per the top slide there, cross section through the loin. Feed conversion for a lamb to get to that stage is probably an 4 to 1, pretty good feed conversion. But fat is expensive to create, trim off, and dispose of, and the lower slide there that shows that surplus fat is not going to help either your bottom line or the processor and the consumer's bottom line either. So know when to quit. Body condition scoring is certainly useful in that regard. A body condition of 3, maybe 3.5 is what the target is. And there's the description of what a 3 looks like. But most sheep producers are pretty familiar with the body condition scoring system and can use that effectively. Using a scale as well. Sometimes, even though lambs might be lean enough, if they're of a breed that's really too large for the market, then you need to know that. So there can be discounts just based on weight, even if lambs aren't over fat. So a scale is a big key part of your operation as well if you're going to be feeding very many lambs. The grading system is done by a grade ruler shown in the left there. Yield grade 1, which is the highest grade, has a measurement of 5 to 12 millimeters or 0.2 to 0.5 inches. And you can see the wide variation of those lambs on the rail there, and what the processor has to deal with in terms of trying to break that down and market that appropriately. So again, a consistent understanding of the grading system will certainly help you in that regard. So we've talked about grain feeding and required for profit. Certain systems work, and adjustment to grain is highly important. There's some diseases and disorders that are preventable with good management and good health and nutrition programs, and then know when your market, know when to stop. So Rob, and I think we'll stop there and give people a chance to ask questions. I don't know if any of them have come in to you or not, but please read them out if you've got any there handy.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Dale, for your presentation. Just a reminder to everyone on the call here, you are muted, so that means you can't actually ask a question out loud. You do have to physically type it into the little question box you see there. Going to allow for about 5 to 10 minutes of questions here, so people can start typing in their questions, and I will read them out loud to get them answered by Dale. I already do have some questions that have come in, which is excellent. So we'll start with, I've heard of sodium bicarb being added to feeder lamb rations. Does it help, and how should it be used? Dale.
Well, sodium bicarb is one of the buffers that we have available to us that I mentioned in the talk there. So the best way to do it is add it to your pelleted supplement, for example, or a premix that you can get into the ration. Or if you've got a total mixed ration, you can add it yourself to the total ration. That's probably the very best way because it'll mask any flavor issues there. Another question we get relative to sodium bicarb is, can I self-feed that? So can I put it in a box and put it in front of the sheep? Will they eat it? Should I mix it with salt? And yeah, it's always preferred to add it to the ration, and we add about 1% if we want to add a buffer of total dry matter, and that seems to be effective in keeping acidosis in line. So free choice consumption is going to be variable from sheep to sheep, and that's always an issue. I even have people, though, that are feeding high forage rations to the ewes that want to put sodium bicarb out in front of the ewes, and I don't see a role for sodium bicarb in that situation. But certainly lambs on feed, if you haven't got sodium bicarb in the ration and you're having problems with acidosis, it's worth putting out in a box in the pen to see if they will consume it, and kind of monitor the consumption. Anytime we're feeding a free choice mineral product of any sort, we like to keep an eye on what the consumption is. So use it if you think it's going to be a benefit in an acidosis situation, but don't waste your money if you're on a high forage ration with the ewe flock, I guess is my message.
Okay, great. I've got another question here. How to control algae buildup in plastic water bowls? Having to clean on a regular basis, generally metal water bowls perform better? Question.
Yeah, of course, algae growth in water bowls is promoted by light. So if you've got a plastic water bowl or a tub even that allows light to come through versus a solid black one that doesn't, you'll see more algae growth and build up there. But if it's, you've got the water bowls that you've got, so you have to deal with that. And I know in my situation, I'm constantly out there every day, swirling the water around, tossing out the nutrients like the manure and so on that might have got in there, and cleaning it. So it's a management situation, and you just got to have somebody on top of it all the time to get that out of the water bowl and allow that to be reasonably clean, and you'll increase intake of water, which is so important, especially during hotter weather. But it's a labor issue. There's not any real magical additives that I'm aware of that will prevent the buildup of that particular problem in the water bowl. If you've got algae growth in dugouts and so on, talk to your local water engineer, but things like adding limestone to the dugout and so on can reduce algae growth in the dugout if that's your source of the problem.
Okay, we've got one more question here, so just kind of your last minute warning here for everyone on the line. If you have a question, this is your last chance to type it in. I'll read this last question out to Dale. We'll see if we get any others that come in. So here's the question, Dale. We have trouble with diarrhea in lambs throughout the feeder period. We lamb 3 times a year, and it's always the May lambs that have trouble through the summer. They're weaned at 60 days. They're creep fed with 3-in-1 feeders and fed whole barley, DDGs, and poor quality grass hay. We deworm with flicover at weaning, and we know the parasites are sensitive to this medication. What else should we try?
Well, certainly look at coccidiosis as a cause for that, and taking fecal samples into your veterinarian will confirm whether coccidiosis is an issue there. So it sounds like you've done everything right with respect to the physical form of the ration and so on. I don't think that should be shouldn't be acidosis that's causing the diarrhea. I would suspect though that it could be coccidiosis. And are you using Bovatec in the ration, for example, to prevent coccidiosis, or Rumensin? Or even having to go to the extreme of using decox. But that summer, that springtime there, when the weather warms up and the pens are a little bit wetter and that type of thing, is often the time when we see the greatest problems with coccidiosis. Even in barns where there's no access to the outdoors, when the temperature warms up, we still see major issues with coccidiosis. So I would say that it's time to look at an ionophore if you haven't done that. In some situations, we've had to even go to the more powerful decoconate or decox formulations at higher levels to get a handle on it.
Okay. Great, thanks, Dale. That is actually all the questions that have come in, and looks like we're right on time here to finish at noon as we planned. So won't keep anybody on the line anymore, but really appreciate everyone who joined us today. And I want to say a big thank you to Dale, who is able to come and share his expertise. And we hope to see you back here in about 3 weeks for Dale's next webinar on feed and water testing. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dale. And I hope everyone has a fantastic day.
Thank you, Robin.